Few people know, but in 1961, a Soviet Cold War submarine came within minutes of turning a technical error into a global catastrophe. And the most astonishing part, this story remained hidden for decades. It was the height of the Cold War. The United States and the Soviet Union were on edge, each side waiting for the other to make the slightest mistake. In the middle of it all appeared the Cold War submarine K-19, the pride of the Soviet fleet, hailed as the most advanced of its time. For Moscow, it was a symbol of power. For the crew, it was a burden heavy enough to crush anyone. Inside that steel hull, the atmosphere was suffocating. There was no room for error. A technical problem could be seen as military incompetence or even as treason. Imagine carrying a secret so heavy that, if revealed, it could put your entire country at risk. That was exactly how every sailor lived day after day. The K-19 was more than just a submarine. It guarded Soviet Navy secrets, designed to intimidate the enemy and prove the USSR's technological superiority. But even the smallest flaw could turn everything into catastrophe. And the greatest fear of all was a nuclear reactor meltdown, an event that could drag the entire planet into an irreversible conflict. Beneath the silence of the ocean, the men on board knew they were carrying an invisible monster. Any mistake could ignite the spark of nuclear war, and that was only the beginning. Because once inside the depths of the K-19, they discovered that the submarine's very structure concealed even more secrets and even greater dangers. The Cold War submarine K-19 was not imposing only on the outside. Its internal structure was designed like a floating fortress, divided into 9 compartments grouped into 3 sections. At the front were the captain's cabin, the communication systems with Moscow, and the dreaded torpedoes. Every decision made there carried strategic weight, and any disruption in communication could mean deadly silence in the middle of the Cold War. At the center lay the heart of the threat, nuclear warheads stored in vertical silos. These weapons were part of the Soviet Navy secrets, with enough destructive power to change the fate of the planet in mere minutes. It was like having an entire city hidden beneath the sea guarding an arsenal no one could see, but everyone feared. At the rear was the most delicate point, the nuclear reactors. They kept the K-19 moving, but they also posed the greatest danger. A nuclear reactor meltdown there wouldn't just destroy the submarine, it could be misinterpreted as an accidental nuclear strike. It was like driving a sports car knowing the fuel tank could explode at any moment. Each section of the submarine reflected a mix of technology and extreme risk. The sailors lived with the constant sense of being inside a metallic labyrinth where every door concealed both protection and danger. In the silence of the depths, 3 lights began flashing on the control panel of the Cold War submarine K-19. The first signaled a radio failure. Communication with Moscow had vanished. Imagine being trapped hundreds of feet below the ocean, unable to report to your commander or call for help. To the Soviet High Command, that detail could look like weakness. To the crew, it was the first warning that they were truly on their own. Then came the second light. The silos holding the ballistic missiles began to overheat. These warheads, part of the Soviet Navy secrets, were not ordinary weapons. They carried an unprecedented power of destruction. If an accident occurred, the enemy might interpret it as an attack, and a simple technical error could trigger World War III. It was the tension of global politics condensed into a space smaller than a school building. The third light was the most terrifying, a failure in the reactor system. The risk of a nuclear reactor meltdown was real. Heat was rising, and with each passing minute, the safety margin grew thinner. It was like driving a car at high speed, knowing the brakes could fail at any moment. That was the kind of agony eating away at every member of the crew. 3 warnings, 3 threats that could alter the course of history. For the sailors, this was no longer about simply following orders. Their lives and possibly the lives of millions beyond the submarine depended on what they did next. But what truly haunted them was grasping the magnitude of the nuclear threat they carried beneath the sea. The UR-13 warheads on board the Cold War submarine K-19 carried staggering firepower, Each one had 66 times the yield of the bomb dropped on Hiroshima in 1945, according to historical data from the Atomic Heritage Foundation. That meant that within seconds, the world could witness destruction capable of erasing entire cities from the map. The crew knew that any mistake could bring consequences far beyond the ocean. The danger wasn't only the power of the warheads, but also where the submarine was sailing. It was close to NATO bases, and an accident could easily be interpreted as a deliberate attack. Imagine the tension. A simple nuclear reactor meltdown inside the K-19 could show up on enemy radars as the start of war. What was merely a technical failure could instantly become the trigger for World War III. These weapons weren't just part of the Soviet Navy secrets, they were also a psychological game. Moscow wanted to project power, but the sailors bore the crushing weight of making sure they didn't accidentally unleash the apocalypse. It was like holding a lit match inside a gasoline depot, knowing that one wrong move would end everything. The fear came not only from the weapons, but from the silence. Inside the submarine, there was no way to confirm how the enemy would react to a failure. Would it be seen as an accident or as an attack? And in that uncertainty, the crew still had to confront something even more suffocating. Living inside the Cold War submarine K-19 was an experience few could endure. Officers still had the luxury of sharing cabins, but most of the crew slept in triple bunks, crammed into narrow corridors where you could barely stretch your legs. There were no showers on board, and the air was always heavy thick with oil, metal, and the constant tension of war. That confinement wasn't just physical, it was psychological. Imagine spending months locked inside, knowing a nuclear reactor meltdown could happen at any moment. The stress slowly ate away at the men, each of them finding different ways to cope with the pressure. Some kept diaries, others clung to military discipline, as if routine itself were a shield against fear. And perhaps that's why stories like this still capture so much attention today. They reveal that, even in the most unlikely places, human beings find strength to endure. If this kind of narrative makes sense to you and sparks curiosity, it's worth subscribing to the channel and leaving a like so you can follow other hidden stories of the Cold War and never lose the thread of this conversation. But the truth is, what consumed the sailors most wasn't the lack of space or comfort. The real nightmare began when the heat from the reactors climbed to unbearable levels. And the most feared moment came when the reactor system began to fail. The temperature hit 300, and the engineers knew that if it reached 600, there would be a real risk of explosion. Inside the Cold War submarine K-19, that didn't just mean losing the vessel, it meant the looming specter of a nuclear reactor meltdown in the middle of the ocean, one that could easily be interpreted as an enemy attack. The cruelest detail was that the submarine had no emergency cooling system. It had been hastily built to impress Moscow and showcase the power of the Soviet Navy secrets to the world. It was like buying a luxury car without brakes, shiny on the outside, but hiding fatal flaws that only revealed themselves when it was already too late. That flaw turned fear into outright despair. The crew understood they were sitting on top of a ticking time bomb. Many wondered, are we going to become the first underwater Chernobyl? The comparison wasn't an exaggeration. An accident could poison the sea and unleash global consequences. With every degree the reactor climbed, the men felt as if they were living out the last minutes of their lives. Amid the chaos inside the Cold War submarine K-19, one detail shifted the atmosphere on board. An American warship had picked up the distress signal. The approach was swift, and for the first time, an escape seemed possible. But accepting help from the enemy was not so simple. For the Soviets, it could mean exposing Soviet Navy secrets in the middle of the Cold War. Captain Zadev knew his crew was in danger, but he also understood the gravity of the choice. Accepting help might save lives, but it would hand strategic information over to the United States. Refusing meant facing the threat of a nuclear reactor meltdown alone, with no support. It was a dilemma that blended patriotic duty with the raw instinct to survive. The decision came quickly, and it was harsh. American assistance was refused. For those inside the submarine, that order sounded like a death sentence. The feeling was one of absolute isolation, as if the entire world had closed in around them. Every sailor knew that from that moment on, there was no margin left for mistakes. That refusal made one thing clear to the crew: they were truly on their own in the face of collapse. With no external support, improvisation was the only option. On board the Cold War submarine K-19, the engineers devised a desperate plan, rerouting the potable water system into the reactor's ventilation. It was a nuclear-scale workaround, one that might delay a nuclear reactor meltdown, but at a staggering cost. The task had to be carried out inside the reactor chamber, an environment saturated with radiation. Entering that space was like signing one's own death warrant. Even so, men stepped forward to volunteer. They understood they were facing something greater than their own lives. They were carrying the Soviet Navy secrets and knew that any failure could trigger a global war. There was no decorated heroism, only duty. One of them even said he would rather die trying to save his comrades than sit back and wait for the explosion. That attitude summed up the spirit of the crew, where heroic sacrifice wasn't a choice, it was an inevitable consequence. With every step, the tension mounted, radiation burned through their strength, and every minute spent inside that chamber meant years cut from their lives. Yet even knowing this, the engineers accepted the challenge, beginning a deadly rotation that would be remembered in history. They entered the reactor chamber in shifts of only 10 minutes. Any longer and survival was impossible. Each man knew he was receiving a brutal dose of radiation, but none of them hesitated. The Cold War submarine K-19 had become the stage for a silent, heroic sacrifice, where the lives of many depended on the courage of a few. The exposure was devastating, around 5,400 rem 13 times above the lethal limit, according to historical records from the U.S. Nuclear Regulatory Commission. Nobody could withstand such a burden. Within days, 8 men died as a direct consequence, while others carried the scars for the rest of their lives. And yet, they succeeded in slowing the progress of the nuclear reactor meltdown. That sacrifice saved 131 lives on board. Each engineer who stepped into the chamber knew he was unlikely to ever return home, but still he pressed forward. It was as if every step carried a clear message: if my life ends here, at least it won't be in vain. The Soviet Navy secrets remained preserved, but more importantly, the planet had been spared a nuclear disaster in the midst of the Cold War. The human cost was immense, and the consequences would echo for years to come. For those who survived, the battle didn't end at sea. The real fight began when they returned home, carrying the invisible consequences of radiation. Many faced physical aftereffects, but the heavier burden was in their minds. Inside that Cold War submarine, every memory of the looming nuclear reactor meltdown became a ghost that would not let them sleep. Post-traumatic stress became a silent mark. Some men were tormented by recurring nightmares, reliving the unbearable heat of the reactor chamber. Others lived in fear of speaking out, knowing that revealing even the slightest detail of the Soviet Navy secrets could land them directly in prison. It was a life of forced silence, where even tears had to remain hidden. The struggle to return to normal life was evident. Imagine going back to your family and being unable to explain why your body was weak, or why your gaze always seemed distant. These survivors carried within them a kind of loneliness few could ever understand. The heroic sacrifice had saved lives, but it had stolen theirs in a different way, and that hidden pain stretched across decades. For years, the official record denied what had happened, leaving the sailors trapped in memories they could never share. Right after the disaster, silence became the official order. The Soviet government could not admit that the Cold War submarine K-19, the pride of the fleet, had nearly caused a nuclear reactor meltdown in the middle of the ocean. Thus began a strict cover-up. Reports were buried, families were given false information, and the truth was turned into yet another of the Soviet Navy secrets. The surviving sailors were instructed never to speak about what they had witnessed. The threats were clear: anyone who talked could end up in prison. Imagine carrying deep trauma while being forbidden to share it, even with your own family. Many went to their graves with secrets they were never allowed to reveal. To the outside world, nothing had happened. The official narrative kept the image of Soviet strength intact. That silence, however, came at a heavy price. While the men suffered in silence, the planet remained unaware of how close it had come to a nuclear war triggered by a simple accident aboard a submarine. The weight of the cover-up lasted for decades. But with the fall of the Soviet Union, the barriers began to crumble, and information once locked away in secret archives finally came to light. Decades passed before the men of the Cold War submarine K-19 were remembered with fairness. Only in 2006, many years after the collapse of the Soviet Union, were medals finally awarded posthumously to the crew who gave their lives. The world at last acknowledged the heroic sacrifice that had prevented a tragedy of incalculable proportions. It was more than a symbolic tribute. For the families, this gesture meant validation, the certainty that their loved ones had not died in vain. They were not merely sailors who suffered in silence. They were guardians who prevented a nuclear reactor meltdown at the height of the Cold War, preserving not only the Soviet Navy secrets, but also world peace. And yet, the delayed recognition carried a bitter taste. Many survivors had already passed away without ever seeing justice done. It was as if the truth had arrived too late, like a letter traveling for years only to reach its destination when no one remained to read it. Even so, their story was forever marked not as victims of an accident, but as men who, at the cost of their own lives, kept humanity from plunging into nuclear war. And it is precisely this forgotten episode that reveals just how much a secret can shape the future. The Cold War submarine K-19 remains etched as one of the most dangerous episodes of the Cold War. The heroic sacrifice of its crew prevented a nuclear reactor meltdown that could have triggered World War III. For decades, this chapter was buried as part of the Soviet Navy secrets, until it finally came to light. The truth is that millions of people never knew how close the world came to disaster. And only now can we recognize the price paid by those men who took risks no one else would have dared to face. If you want to keep uncovering hidden stories like this, make sure to subscribe and turn on notifications. And of course, leave a like to support the continuation of this work.